Hello. I've got the last two chapters of The Invisible Dog, chapter 7 and 8, and I'm just going to read them together today. Chapter 7. To go to see the litter of Great Dane puppies without Janie, her parents decided, was now impossible. She must be allowed to come too. After all, the promise had been made, and if she had the money, she could have the puppy. And now, by what they could only think of was the most amazing coincidence, the money was hers. The exact money, what's more. So you remember how Janie's dad's great uncle left some money to Janie, and it's the exact amount that's needed to buy a puppy. But we must telephone the kennel, Janie's mother said, and see if they'll keep the Harlequin. She listened anxiously to her husband's side of the conversation. Good morning. I'm inquiring about the pups you advertised. Are they sold? I see. But do you still have the Harlequin? Is it a male or a female? Oh, okay. Oh, good. That's the one we're interested in. Can you keep him for us? Yes, I understand. We must take a chance on that. We can't be with you till around 4:30. By the way, how much are you asking for him? The answer to this last question seemed to take some time, but at last Janie's father put down the phone. The Harlequin puppy is a dog. It's a male, and he's not sold. The woman said she couldn't guarantee to keep him for us. She sold a couple of the others, but hasn't had anyone after the Harlequin yet. How much? Janie's mother asked. She seemed to ask a lot of questions and took a lot of time answering when you asked her that. That's because she was giving me a long spiel about how well bred this litter is and what the mother had won and the fact that the father is a champion from what's its name, Nobleman something another. You know, the dog that won the dog show. So, how much? 500 pounds. What amazed them both, looking back on the whole business, was the calm certainty which Janie seemed to have that everything would turn out right. She was excited, of course, when they picked her up from school. While they were driving the 30-odd miles to the kennel, they told her what had happened. She sat in back with Henry, lying invisible beside her, and heard about Uncle Melville and the money and the Harlequin puppy. But he's the only one, her mother said. He may have been sold by the time we get there. There they are, riding in the car on the way to see the puppy. Anyway, you might like one of those black or blue puppies, her father said. No, said Janie. It's got to be a Harlequin, just like Henry. It'll be all right, you'll see. I know I'm going to be lucky. She said so. Who said so? Mrs. Garrow. Well, what on earth did Mrs. Garrow got to do with it? She saw it. I don't know what you're talking about, Janie, her father said. We just don't want you to be disappointed, her mother said. But when they arrived at the kennel and found that the Harlequin puppy had been sold, Janie didn't seem the least bit worried. I'm awfully sorry, the breeder said. Someone turned up a couple of hours after you phoned. I did warn you. She looked at Janie, who stood leash in hand, collar dangling. That's a biggish collar, the breeder said. Have you had a Dane before? Yes, we had one called Rupert, Janie said, when I was very small. Well, if it's a dog puppy you want, there are 3 left, 2 blacks and a blue. No, thank you, Janie said. We don't want to see them. We have to have a Harlequin, like this one. Which one? Janie has an invisible dog, her father said. He goes everywhere with her. He's never any trouble. Sit, Henry, Janie said. Did you say Henry? Said the breeder. Well, I never. How odd. She looked thoughtful. I can't say I've ever seen an invisible Great Dane before, she said. She turned to Janie's parents. You're set on having a harlequin? That appears so, they said. Does it have to be a puppy? I don't follow you, Janie's father said. Well, I don't know whether you'd be interested, but I do have a 9-month-old harlequin dog that might suit you. He's a good typical specimen with a lovely nature, but he has a fault that spoils him for the show ring. What sort of a fault? He's got a kink in his tail, a little sort of twist near the end of it. He was born like that, but I've kept him because he's such a lovable character. Would you like to see him? Of course, they fell in love with him at first sight. Already he seemed enormous, with feet like soup plates. He did not squirm or wriggle as a puppy would have done, but stood steady in black and white dignity, as befitted someone who was almost grown up. His nose is part black and part pink, Janie's father said as the young dog sniffed at them. That's right, the breeder said. A harlequin's allowed a butterfly nose. And he's got one brown eye and one blue, said Janie's mother as the dog smiled at them. That's all right, too. It's just that kink at the end of the tail that's all wrong. As if he understood, the dog wagged his tail slowly. I like that, Janie said. I want to buy him, please. So there Janie and her parents. And there is the dog. And if you can see that little tiny curve in his tail, that makes him so he's not very good as a show dog, because show dogs are supposed to be looking like a perfect example of their type. So that little curly tail makes him look a little funny to them. You want to? Said the breeder, smiling. Have you got enough money of your own, do you think? Oh, yes, said Janie. I've got 500 pounds. The breeder laughed. Well, I'm certainly not going to charge you that much, she said. Like I said, he's no good for show with that fault, but I don't think I can give him to you. He's cost me a lot to raise. On the other hand, I feel sure that you'll give him a really good home. So, shall we say 100 pounds? Janie put out her hand. It's a deal, she said. What's he called? You aren't going to believe it, the breeder said. In fact, I must confess that there's something very strange about it all, but he's called Henry. Janie nodded. It was as though she had expected this news. Carefully, she unbuckled the collar from the invisible dog and fastened it around the neck of his successor. Good boy, Henry, she said. Chapter 8. About a week later, Janie came out of the front gate and turned up the lane, the leash in her left hand, her dog walking steadily at heel with his long strides, his head not far from her shoulder. From the buckle of his collar hung a new round metal disc that said, above the telephone number, Henry. They walked through the village until they came to Mrs. Garrow's wall with the red mailbox built into it. Janie opened the garden gate and went in. Inside the porch of the cottage were Mrs. Garrow's galoshes, and leaning in the corner, the long broomstick that she had used for sweeping up leaves. Her cat sat on the mat. My old black cat doesn't like dogs, Mrs. Garrow said, but to Janie's surprise, the cat stood up and began to rub itself against one of Henry's long legs, purring loudly. Henry looked embarrassed. Janie knocked on the front door, and after a moment, old Mrs. Garrow opened it, smiling her crinkly smile. Hello, Janie said. This is Henry. I know that, dear, said Mrs. Garrow. You showed him to me before, lots of times. Don't you remember? She patted the dog. Who's a good boy, then? She said. He's looking very well, Janie. You must be proud of him. I am, Janie said. Do you know? He's got a butterfly nose. And different colored eyes. And a twist in the tail, said Mrs. Garrow. It was all in the tea leaves. How could you know all that? Said Janie. Mrs. Guerra let out her usual volley of quacks. Ah, Janie, my dear, that's the twist in the tail. And that word is T-A-L-E, the twist in the tail, which is the twist in the story. How about that? So that book had a little bit of magic in it, maybe. What do you think? Just a little smidgen of magic. Mrs. Guerra seemed a little bit magical. She certainly knew all about Henry before Janie knew about Henry, right? And that's the end of the book. Well, thanks for listening.